It was a morning that nobody in Los Angeles, or perhaps anywhere, could have prepared for. The sun had barely risen, casting a cold light over the grand, tree-lined streets of Brentwood, when news broke that would shake Hollywood to its very core. Imagine walking into your day, scrolling through headlines, and seeing the name of a beloved director, the kind whose films shaped generations, paired with the unimaginable. You stop mid-scroll. Your heart skips. Your mind races. Could this really be happening? Could someone who seemed larger than life, someone whose laughter filled studios and whose creativity brought magic to screens, be gone in an instant, his life violently stolen? And if so, by whom? That is the question that would haunt every corner of Los Angeles, every living room, every gossip column, and every newsroom for the weeks to come. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The focus, at first, was disbelief. Rob Reiner, known worldwide for his charm, his infectious energy, and his body of work spanning decades, was suddenly a name whispered in hushed tones with horror. Alongside him, his partner, Michelle Singer Reiner, herself a pillar of creativity and elegance, was also gone. The shock wasn't just in the act itself, it was the staggering betrayal wrapped within it. Who could commit such a crime? Who could stand in the shadows of a family's life and extinguish two shining lights in one horrific, unthinkable act? And the answer, the revelation that would turn disbelief into terror, was closer to home than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was a son, the youngest son, known to the world only in passing. A 32-year-old whose existence had largely been behind the scenes, was now thrust into the harsh glare of public scrutiny. And not just scrutiny. He was facing accusations so grave they could carry the ultimate penalty, death. Pause for a moment and consider that. A son accused of taking the lives of his parents. What drives someone to the edge of morality so profoundly that the very people who brought them into the world, nurtured them, protected them, are no longer safe from their own blood? Psychologists, true crime experts, and even casual observers would later scramble to piece together the fragments of a life that had spiraled out of control, but at that moment, none of it made sense. And yet, the courtroom was about to reveal the fragments, piece by piece, in a spectacle no one could look away from. The morning of the court appearance was as surreal as the headlines had hinted. Picture the scene. A high-security courtroom buzzing with tension, the chatter of reporters echoing off the walls, and in the center, a figure who had been known quietly, almost invisibly, was now the epicenter of every gaze. Shackles clinked against the floor with each step, a suicide prevention smock stark against the otherwise formal, dark clothing of the courtroom. Cameras clicked. Flashbulbs popped. The youngest Reiner, Nick, had never been a public figure in the way his father was, yet suddenly every eye, every lens, every recording device was trained on him. And the energy in the room was electric, charged with anticipation, judgment, fear, and morbid curiosity all at once. For the public, the world was watching someone who seemed ordinary transform into something unrecognizable under the weight of unimaginable allegations. The lawyers had already issued their statements, rehearsed their carefully measured words, but they were no match for the raw, unfolding drama. Outside the courtroom, one could hear snippets of conversation, debates breaking out in real time. "I just can't believe it. He seemed so normal. What could have driven him to this? Is there more we don't know?" These weren't just idle questions. They were premonitions of the twists and turns that would define every moment of the case, every revelation that would emerge over the coming days, weeks, and months. And then there was the statement of the defense attorney, Alan Jackson, calm, controlled, pleading for the public to refrain from judgment. The juxtaposition was stark, a lawyer urging patience and due process while the world screamed for answers, for justice, for explanations that might never fully come. But even before the first legal argument was made, the tension reached a boiling point. Nick Reiner, the accused, began to act in ways no one expected. Whispers turned to murmurs, murmurs to gasps, and gasps to outright shock. What exactly triggered it? The crowd, the accusations, the weight of reality, remains unclear. But the result was undeniable. A courtroom scene spiraled into chaos, a young man fighting against not just the physical constraints, but the psychological torment of facing what could be the end of everything he knew. The details of his actions were both horrifying and tragic, a collision of human frailty and explosive emotion. And for everyone watching, lawyers, journalists, spectators, the question burned hotter with every passing second. How had it come to this? How did a family, celebrated, seemingly cohesive, suddenly unravel into a spectacle that felt like something out of a nightmare? As this story unfolds, there are patterns to notice, contradictions to unravel, and moments that seem too stark, too surreal to be real. There is the history of the family, the public personas, the private lives, all colliding in a drama that rivals fiction. And for those who follow closely, it becomes clear that every detail matters. Every action, every glance, every whispered word carries weight. A parent's life cut short, a son in shackles, a courtroom that becomes a theater of human emotion, tension, and suspense. Each element is a thread in a tapestry of tragedy, betrayal, and shocking revelation. And yet, for all the chaos, one cannot help but ask, what will happen next? How will the events of that morning define not only the legal battle ahead, but the public perception of a family once held in such high esteem? How deep do the motivations, the secrets, the hidden dynamics of this household go? We have seen the collapse of an image, the shattering of an illusion of normalcy. We have glimpsed, in fleeting moments, the extremes of human behavior, the potential for darkness within those we think we know. But the story has only begun. The courtroom doors are closed for now, but beyond them lies a series of revelations that will challenge assumptions, ignite debate, and shock even the most seasoned observers of high-profile cases. So, as we take this journey together, brace yourself. The drama, the emotion, the heartbreak, and the chaos are only going to intensify. Every moment builds upon the last. Each revelation opens the door to another question, another twist, another cliffhanger. We are not merely spectators. We are witnesses to a descent that will defy expectation. And at the heart of it, the most pressing question remains. Can anyone truly comprehend the forces that led a son to face such catastrophic consequences? Or is the truth far more complicated, far darker than anyone could imagine? The sun had barely risen over the skyline of Los Angeles when the first whispers began circulating in the affluent neighborhoods of Brentwood. Most mornings, these streets were filled with the soft hum of luxury cars, joggers, and dog walkers. But on this day, there was an eerie tension, a crackling undercurrent of disbelief that seemed to seep from every elegant home and manicured lawn. The headlines hadn't even fully registered yet, but those who heard them felt a chill. A son, 32 years old, accused of murdering his own parents? How could a family that seemed so normal, so polished, so untouchable, descend into such chaos? Imagine, for a moment, the feeling that must have gripped friends, neighbors, and colleagues alike. A mix of fear, horror, and a kind of paralyzing curiosity. You want to look away. You tell yourself it's impossible. But you can't. Because there's something magnetic about tragedy, especially when it's wrapped in the veneer of wealth, fame, and a life that seemed perfect on the surface. And that was exactly what the world faced when Nick Reiner's name entered the headlines. Who was Nick Reiner, really? For years, he had lived largely out of the spotlight, overshadowed by his father's immense fame as a director and actor. Rob Reiner's name was synonymous with Hollywood excellence, a household name whose films shaped generations. And Michelle Singer Reiner, elegant and accomplished in her own right, had built a life alongside him that seemed enviable to all who watched from a distance. But fame has a way of obscuring the ordinary. While the world focused on red carpets and awards, the family dynamics behind closed doors remained invisible. And then came the moment that shattered the illusion. The police announcement. The charges. The words that almost nobody wanted to hear. First-degree murder. Multiple victims. A knife allegedly used. A special circumstance added to the mix. Suddenly, the carefully curated image of a happy, successful family became a nightmare. And in the midst of it all, Nick Reiner, a young man who had been quietly living his life, was thrust into a whirlwind of scrutiny, accusation, and speculation. Step into the courtroom that morning. The air was thick with anticipation. Cameras lined the perimeter, reporters jostling for a better view. Microphones extended to capture every word. Observers held their breath as the doors opened, revealing a figure who would define the day's narrative. Shackles clinked against the polished marble floor with each step. The bright orange of a suicide prevention smock was in stark contrast to the dark suits and somber attire surrounding him. And there he was, Nick Reiner, suddenly transformed from a background figure into the center of a media frenzy. You might wonder, watching this from your screen or in the news footage, what was going through his mind? Fear? Rage? Desperation? Or a combination too complex for outsiders to understand? One thing was clear: this was not a man in control of his environment. The tension in his posture, the darting of his eyes, the tremor in his hands, it all spoke volumes. Lawyers, reporters, and spectators alike were forced to confront the unpredictability of human behavior when weighed down by extreme stress and unimaginable circumstances. And it didn't stop there. As proceedings began, Nick Reiner's actions became increasingly erratic. Perhaps it was the realization of the charges against him, or the suffocating pressure of public attention. Whatever the cause, the courtroom began to feel less like a place of order and more like a theater of psychological drama. Shouts erupted, staff moved quickly to restrain him, and the stunned silence of the room oscillated with murmurs of disbelief. Every second was a revelation. Every glance exchanged among those present carried unspoken questions. How could this have escalated so quickly? What drives a person to such extremes? Outside, the atmosphere mirrored the intensity inside. Journalists scrambled to piece together the fragments of the story, digging into public records, social media posts, and interviews with neighbors and acquaintances. Everyone wanted to understand the why behind the crime. What family secrets might have existed? Were there warning signs that went unnoticed? Experts offered opinions, psychologists dissected behavior, true crime aficionados speculated relentlessly. But amidst all the analysis, the real human drama remained raw and immediate. A young man accused of betraying his parents in the most horrific way imaginable. And the public? They were captivated. How could they not be? The story had everything: fame, wealth, family tension, psychological unraveling, and a shocking betrayal that defied imagination. It wasn't just news, it was a narrative that demanded engagement. People across the country, and even internationally, followed every development, every court appearance, every statement from lawyers or authorities. Every headline and social media post served as another thread pulling the audience deeper into a story that seemed almost too shocking to be real. Yet, for all the attention, questions remained. What had led to this explosive moment in the courtroom? How had family dynamics, personal struggles, and hidden tensions converged into a singular, tragic event? And what was yet to unfold in the legal battle, the media storm, and the personal reckoning of everyone involved? As the day wore on, it became increasingly clear that Nick Reiner's story was not just about one individual. It was a story of human fragility, of pressures both public and private, and of the ways in which appearances can conceal turmoil. The courtroom, in many ways, was a microcosm of a larger social fascination. Why do families fall apart? Why do some individuals react in ways that shock even those closest to them? Why does tragedy, when wrapped in fame and fortune, seem to grip the collective imagination so fiercely? And while the first morning had set the stage, it was only the beginning. Every question asked by journalists, every whispered speculation among spectators, every anxious glance from lawyers and staff, all of it foreshadowed a series of revelations that would challenge assumptions, ignite debate, and push the story into unexpected territories. But just as observers thought they had seen everything, the most dramatic moments of that day were still ahead. The courtroom was a powder keg, waiting for the spark that would send shockwaves far beyond its walls. And in the blink of an eye, what seemed like a controlled legal proceeding became something far more unpredictable, far more human, and far more terrifying. What came next would redefine everything anyone thought they knew about Nick Reiner, his family, and the nature of the unfolding tragedy. And no one, lawyers, spectators, or the public at large, was prepared for the storm that was about to hit. The morning that began like any other in Brentwood ended with a question that would haunt every headline, every news segment, every whispered conversation. How could a family so admired, so celebrated, be torn apart from within in ways that no one saw coming? From the outside, the Reiner family seemed like a storybook example of success, talent, and stability. The kind of family that, in Hollywood, gets photographed walking hand-in-hand down red carpets, waving at fans, smiling for cameras, and appearing untouchable. Rob Reiner's career had spanned decades, leaving a trail of iconic films and an indelible mark on popular culture. Michelle Singer Reiner had carved her own path as a creative professional, admired for her poise, elegance, and intelligence. To the world, their life appeared enviable, almost flawless. But as anyone who studies high-profile families knows, appearances can be deceiving. Have you ever wondered what goes on behind the doors of a house that looks perfect from the street? The truth is, the image we see, polished, public, curated, is often a mask. And sometimes, behind that mask, lies tension, conflict, and unspoken pain. For the Reiners, the world saw fame and success, but only a few glimpsed the undercurrents shaping the family dynamic. And it is within these unseen currents that the seeds of tragedy were planted. Nick Reiner, the youngest of the family, had always been something of an enigma. Unlike his older siblings, he did not pursue the public spotlight. He wasn't frequently photographed at events, he didn't have a public career linked to Hollywood, and he largely stayed out of the media's eye. To casual observers, this was unremarkable, just a private individual in a family of celebrities. But to those who knew him, there were signs of a deeper struggle, subtle indications that life under the shadow of fame and expectation could be isolating and, at times, overwhelming. As a child, Nick had been described as quiet, sensitive, and intelligent. He excelled academically in certain areas, but struggled socially in others. Family members and friends have recounted that while he had moments of warmth and humor, there were times when he seemed withdrawn, almost lost in thought, as if carrying burdens that were invisible to the world. Was it the pressure of living up to a father's legacy? Was it the difficulty of forging an identity separate from the family name? These are questions we can ask, but the answers are rarely simple, especially in a household where public image is paramount. It's important to remember that family dynamics, even in the most seemingly normal homes, are complex. There are roles children unconsciously adopt: the responsible one, the peacemaker, the rebel, the quiet observer. Nick's role appeared to lean toward the observer, someone who internalized tension rather than confronting it directly. And yet, beneath that quiet exterior, emotions can fester, and small grievances can grow into resentment. We see this pattern repeatedly in high-profile families. Those who live under constant scrutiny often hide struggles from public view, building pressure until a breaking point is reached. But what specifically pushed Nick toward the explosive moments that would later define the courtroom scene? Experts point to several contributing factors. There was the weight of expectation. Imagine being a child in a family where one parent is a world-renowned director and the other an accomplished professional. Success, talent, and public admiration are constantly measured and compared. There is implicit pressure to perform, to achieve, to be enough in the eyes of the family and the world. For some, this pressure can serve as motivation. For others, it can feel crushing, an invisible hand tightening around their identity until every action, every decision, every interaction is filtered through fear, inadequacy, and frustration. Then there is the question of relationships within the family. While publicly harmonious, there were, according to sources close to the family, periods of tension, disagreement, and emotional distance. Siblings argue, parents discipline, disagreements flare. But in a family constantly in the spotlight, these normal conflicts are magnified, scrutinized, and sometimes misinterpreted. For someone like Nick, who already struggled with his place in the family hierarchy, these dynamics could intensify feelings of isolation. Loneliness, combined with the pressure to live up to an almost mythical family image, creates fertile ground for emotional volatility. Another key element is the family's approach to mental health and support. In households where public image dominates, seeking help can feel like admitting weakness. If the son who seemed quiet and private also experienced internal battles, anxiety, depression, or anger, there may have been limited avenues for genuine support. And even when support is available, sometimes the weight of expectation prevents someone from accessing it fully. They fear judgment, they fear disappointment, and ultimately, they internalize struggles that could otherwise be mitigated. Consider the symbolism of the Reiner household itself. The sprawling estate, meticulously maintained, presents a facade of stability and success. But even the most beautiful house cannot shield its inhabitants from psychological turbulence. The corridors that echo with laughter and conversations also echo with unspoken conflicts, resentments, and moments of isolation. Nick's upbringing, therefore, was shaped not only by love and opportunity, but also by these invisible forces. Pressure, expectation, comparison, and the need to navigate a family legacy that could feel both inspiring and oppressive. And yet, for all this, it is crucial to remember that nothing in Nick's early life seemed to foreshadow the level of chaos that would later unfold in court. That is part of the shock. We are drawn to stories like this because they disrupt our assumptions. We want to believe that good parenting, a stable household, or public success can prevent tragedy. But human psychology is far more complex. Small cracks, when ignored or unseen, can widen into chasms that no one anticipates. By the time Nick reached adulthood, observers noted subtle changes in his behavior. He became more withdrawn, more defensive, and at times, increasingly volatile. Arguments with family members escalated in intensity, though rarely in public view. Friends reported moments of irritability, emotional swings, and a tendency to retreat when under pressure. These were the early warning signs. Not necessarily predictive of the extreme events to come, but indicative of an individual struggling to reconcile personal identity with the weight of family expectation and public perception. And while outside observers may have noticed some of these signs, no one could fully grasp the intensity of the emotions building beneath the surface. Family members themselves have described moments of tension, arguments that seemed minor but left lingering effects, and a subtle, growing sense that Nick was wrestling with forces he could not articulate. These are the kinds of dynamics that often remain hidden from the public eye, because they are private, because they are messy, because they contradict the polished images of success and harmony. Yet, as all true tragedies unfold, these early patterns are essential to understanding what happens next. They remind us that human behavior is a complex web of inherited tendencies, personal experiences, family dynamics, and external pressures. They remind us that even in families that appear ideal, conflict can simmer beneath the surface, waiting for a catalyst. And they foreshadow the extreme volatility that would later explode in the courtroom. The screaming, the fights, the chaos that left observers questioning how a son could reach such a breaking point. As we peel back the layers of this family story, the contradictions become stark. The public sees perfection. The private world reveals tension. The youngest son, previously quiet and almost invisible, emerges as a central figure in a drama none could have anticipated. And the question looms: what precisely tipped the scales from quiet frustration to explosive action? What moment, what interaction, what internal battle pushed Nick to act in ways that defy comprehension? The answer is complex, layered, and entwined with both human psychology and family dynamics. And while experts and observers may speculate, only those who lived within the household could truly perceive the tensions, fears, and pressures that shaped Nick's trajectory. Every detail, every argument, every missed signal contributed to the conditions that made the courtroom meltdown not just possible, but almost inevitable. But what happened next? The first confrontation in court, the moment that would mark the beginning of chaos, would reveal the full magnitude of these hidden tensions. It would show the world just how far a private struggle could spill into public catastrophe. And no one watching that day could have predicted the spectacle that was about to unfold, a scene that would leave lawyers, reporters, and spectators alike stunned and scrambling to comprehend the unimaginable. The courthouse loomed like a fortress that morning, its stone facade casting long shadows over the polished sidewalks. Reporters, photographers, and legal staff had begun arriving hours before the first scheduled proceedings, their anticipation thick enough to taste. For them, this was not just another case. This was a collision of fame, tragedy, and human drama, a story that would dominate headlines and social feeds alike. Every step of the day was meticulously documented, from the clatter of cameras in the hallways to the whispering of spectators who tried to peer over the edge of the velvet ropes that separated them from the courtroom floor. Imagine stepping into that space as a member of the public or a journalist. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and nervous energy, a tension so tangible it pressed against the skin. The metal detectors hummed in a low, persistent rhythm as each visitor passed through, scanning for threats, a subtle reminder that what was about to unfold was not ordinary. Court security officers, in crisp uniforms, monitored every movement with laser focus. Nothing could be left to chance. The accused, after all, was facing charges of the highest severity, and public attention was at a fever pitch. The setup inside the courtroom itself was almost theatrical. Rows of seats, occupied by journalists and legal observers, framed the polished wooden benches reserved for the defense and prosecution teams. Microphones were strategically placed to capture every utterance, every pause, every reaction. Cameras dotted the perimeter, some stationary, others handheld, their lenses trained like hawks on the proceedings that were about to begin. Every detail was arranged with precision because in cases of this magnitude, even the smallest oversight could spark chaos. And then there was the accused, Nick Reiner, entering the courtroom under circumstances as extraordinary as the charges he faced. The shackles that bound him were a stark symbol of the gravity of his situation. They clinked rhythmically against the floor with each step, an audible reminder that this was no ordinary legal proceeding. The suicide prevention smock he wore, bright and conspicuous, added a surreal element to the scene. It was a visual indicator that mental health concerns were being addressed, yet it also contributed to an air of unpredictability. Could someone in such attire, already under immense emotional strain, remain composed? The anticipation in the room was palpable. Lawyers whispered in low tones, discussing strategy and potential contingencies. Court staff moved efficiently, ensuring the room remained secure and that protocol was followed. Journalists adjusted their cameras and microphones, ready to capture the smallest detail. And somewhere within that complex web of preparation, a question lingered in the air, unspoken yet omnipresent. How would Nick react once the proceedings truly began? It is at moments like these that human psychology becomes as fascinating as it is terrifying. Observers often assume that someone accused of a serious crime will behave in predictable ways, but the truth is far more nuanced. Stress, fear, shame, and rage can converge into behaviors that defy expectation. One small trigger, a whispered comment, a sudden movement, a perceived slight, can ignite an emotional response that spirals out of control. And in a courtroom filled with cameras, reporters, and spectators, every action is magnified, every gesture scrutinized, every reaction recorded for posterity. As the proceedings began, it quickly became evident that the tension was not just in the room. It was in Nick himself. His posture shifted, eyes darted, hands trembled. The defense attorney, Alan Jackson, leaned forward, attempting to maintain calm and control, speaking in measured tones to keep his client grounded. On the other side, the prosecution team watched closely, evaluating both the psychological state of the accused and the tactical opportunities for presenting their case. Every moment was a delicate balancing act, a negotiation between law, human behavior, and public perception. And then the first spark occurred. Perhaps it was a question from the judge, a statement from the prosecution, or a subtle remark from someone in the gallery. Whatever it was, it triggered a reaction that would escalate far beyond anyone's expectations. Nick's voice, initially subdued, rose in intensity. His movements became erratic. Security personnel exchanged urgent glances, anticipating the need to intervene. Observers gasped, their disbelief reflected in every eye. How could someone so young, so seemingly ordinary, erupt with such explosive emotion under the weight of legal scrutiny? It is here that the intersection of human psychology and courtroom drama becomes most evident. Courtrooms are designed to impose structure, order, and authority, but they also place individuals under intense emotional pressure. For someone already struggling with internal conflict, the environment can act as a catalyst for unpredictable behavior. And when that person happens to be the son accused of murdering his parents, the stakes are amplified exponentially. Journalists outside and inside the courtroom struggled to capture the moment accurately. Social media feeds exploded with updates, photos, and videos, each clip highlighting a fraction of the chaos, but none capable of conveying the full intensity of the scene. Commentators debated endlessly. Was this a sign of guilt, a psychological break, or a desperate plea for attention? Could anyone truly understand what was happening in that room? These questions only added to the sense of urgency and fascination that gripped the public. As the situation escalated, court security moved swiftly. Officers flanked Nick, guiding him with firm but measured control to prevent harm to himself or others. The sound of clinking shackles, the rustle of the suicide prevention smock, and the occasional shouted instruction filled the air. Spectators leaned forward, cameras zoomed in, and the tension became almost unbearable. Every heartbeat seemed amplified, every breath charged with anticipation. What would happen next? How far would this emotional eruption go before it was contained? And yet, even in the midst of chaos, there were moments of stark contrast. Legal arguments proceeded in clipped, formal tones. Judges maintained an air of authority, reminding everyone of decorum. Lawyers continued to strategize, weighing every word, every gesture, every reaction. But the human element, the raw, unpredictable emotion, loomed over the proceedings like a storm cloud, ready to break at any moment. The public, glued to screens and social feeds, could only speculate. Some saw a breakdown, others saw defiance, and still others saw a complex blend of both. But regardless of interpretation, the effect was the same. A story that gripped attention, challenged assumptions, and left observers hungry for what would come next. The courtroom, designed to impose order, had become a stage for human drama, a crucible where personal history, family tension, and psychological strain collided. Every gesture, every word, every glance carried weight. And at the center of it all stood Nick Reiner, a young man whose actions that day would become a defining moment in both his life and the public's perception of the tragedy. And just when it seemed that the initial chaos might be contained, something happened that would leave everyone stunned. A single action, subtle to some but explosive in consequence, sent shockwaves through the room. Security personnel acted instantly, lawyers reacted with urgency, and spectators froze in disbelief. Cameras captured every second, social feeds erupted, and the world watched as the courtroom descended into a level of turmoil that no one could have anticipated. What exactly triggered it, and how it would unfold, remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. The morning that began with meticulous preparation had transformed into an unpredictable drama that would haunt everyone present, redefine the narrative, and set the stage for a cascade of revelations, confrontations, and shocking moments that no one could ignore. And the most astonishing part? This was only the beginning. What happened next would not only challenge legal norms, but would expose the full depth of tension, emotion, and volatility lurking beneath the surface of a family already scarred by tragedy. The courtroom had reached a tense calm, a fragile balance between order and chaos, when the first true explosion occurred. For minutes, it seemed as if the structure of the legal proceedings could hold, that perhaps the presence of law, procedure, and authority would impose control over the volatile atmosphere. But beneath the surface, the storm had been building. Every restrained movement, every clipped response, every watchful glance had been feeding a pressure cooker of emotion, and eventually, it became too much to contain. Picture the moment. The judge had just begun to outline the charges, his voice measured, precise, and formal, echoing off the tall walls of the chamber. The gravity of the accusations was clear: 2 counts of first-degree murder, allegations of using a deadly weapon, and special circumstances that could make the legal consequences far more severe. To any observer, these were words of consequence, heavy and unyielding. But for Nick Reiner, hearing them pronounced aloud, the weight of reality finally collided with years of internalized tension, fear, and perhaps unacknowledged resentment. Suddenly, the air shifted. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. A single sharp movement, a hand twitching, a chair scraping the floor, ignited a reaction that no one anticipated. Nick rose from his seat, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, eyes darting wildly from one observer to another. The bright orange of the suicide prevention smock seemed almost to flare under the intense lights, drawing every eye in the room to the young man who had become the epicenter of a human drama that had been simmering for years. What happens in moments like these? How does a person transition from composed, or at least restrained, to completely unhinged in full view of the public? Psychologists would later explain that it is rarely a single trigger. Rather, it is an accumulation of stressors, a confluence of internal and external pressures that suddenly becomes unbearable. In Nick's case, the courtroom itself, the charges, the presence of cameras and reporters, the looming weight of public judgment. All of these factors converged in a perfect storm. As he began to move, the sound of shackles clinking became a metronome for chaos. Security personnel instinctively moved closer, forming a protective barrier to prevent harm to himself, the legal staff, or anyone else in the room. But the rapid escalation left little time for calm intervention. Nick's voice rose in volume, alternating between shouts, muttered threats, and fragmented sentences that only heightened the confusion. Spectators froze, journalists fumbled to capture every angle, and the judge called for order, his voice stern yet betraying a hint of uncertainty. This was no ordinary outburst. It was a full-blown display of volatility, the kind that makes an entire room hold its collective breath, uncertain how it might escalate next. And as observers tried to piece together what was happening, questions erupted. Was this a plea for help? A display of guilt? A psychological breakdown? Or a calculated act designed to manipulate the proceedings? The ambiguity itself added fuel to the story, captivating both the audience inside the courtroom and millions watching from afar. What makes these moments so gripping, so horrifying, is that they reveal the raw human element behind legal proceedings. Law is designed to be structured, predictable, and orderly. But humans, emotional, fallible, complex, rarely fit into neat categories. When a defendant erupts, when control is lost, when the unpredictable takes over, the narrative shifts dramatically. The court transforms from a space of procedure into a theater of tension, suspense, and psychological intrigue. As security struggled to maintain control, Nick's movements became increasingly erratic. He gestured wildly, sometimes pointing toward members of the courtroom, sometimes flailing in directions that seemed random but were charged with intent. Lawyers stepped cautiously closer, attempting to de-escalate, their measured words drowned out by the volume of the outburst. Cameras captured every second, a close-up of eyes wide with fear, a hand striking a desk, a shuffling of feet that seemed both desperate and defiant. And through it all, the audience outside could only imagine the full intensity of the scene, their minds filling in gaps with speculation, fear, and morbid curiosity. One of the most chilling aspects of this confrontation was the unpredictability of Nick's behavior. He moved between moments of apparent lucidity, pausing, taking a deep breath, responding coherently to a question, and sudden bursts of rage or panic. Observers would later describe the oscillation as almost surreal, like watching someone teeter on the edge of a cliff, swaying dangerously between control and collapse. And the impact was immediate. Security personnel had to constantly recalibrate their approach, while journalists and spectators struggled to process the unfolding spectacle. It's worth asking, what was going through the minds of those directly involved? For the judge, every word had to be measured, every command clear, as any misstep could escalate the situation further. For the defense attorney, the challenge was monumental. To maintain credibility, provide protection for the client, and navigate the unpredictable currents of human behavior. And for the prosecution, the calculus was equally complex: to observe, document, and respond in ways that supported the case without provoking further chaos. Every participant was acutely aware that the stakes were not only legal but psychological, ethical, and deeply human. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the story exploded across media platforms. Tweets, Video clips and news updates circulated rapidly, each iteration amplifying the drama. Observers debated what they had seen, sharing theories about Nick's mental state, motivations, and possible regrets. Every angle, every camera shot, every eyewitness account became a building block in the narrative, shaping public perception even before the legal process could unfold. The courtroom had become a stage not just for law, but for storytelling, unscripted, raw, and dangerously compelling. And yet, for all the attention, the human cost remained central. Nick's outburst was not simply a media spectacle. It was a manifestation of psychological pressure, family tension, and emotional overwhelm. Behind the headlines, the legal arguments, and the viral footage, there was a young man grappling with forces that few could fully comprehend. And as the courtroom struggled to regain control, it became clear that the events of that morning were only a prelude to an even more dramatic series of confrontations that would continue to unfold, each one revealing new facets of both Nick's psyche and the tragic dynamics of a family under extraordinary stress. Observers outside and inside the courtroom were left with a single, haunting question. How far would this volatility go? Could anyone intervene successfully? And most importantly, what would happen when the first real legal arguments began to intersect with raw human emotion, pushing everyone, lawyers, judges, and spectators alike, into uncharted territory? As security finally managed to restrain Nick temporarily, a tense silence fell over the room. Everyone exhaled, but the relief was brief. The energy, the chaos, the volatility, it hadn't disappeared. It had only been contained, temporarily held at bay by the structure of the courtroom and the rapid response of those present. And in the minds of all who witnessed it, one question lingered with an almost unbearable weight. Was this outburst a singular moment, or merely the beginning of a series of explosive events that would continue to escalate as the trial progressed? Because one thing was now certain: the courtroom, the public, and even Nick himself had entered a space from which there would be no turning back. The story was accelerating, the tension was intensifying, and what would come next would redefine everything that anyone thought they understood about this family, this young man, and the human capacity for both emotional fragility and unforeseen action. And just when the audience thought the situation had reached its peak, the next incident would erupt. Unpredictable, shocking, and irreversible. The tension that had been simmering in the courtroom for hours now reached a new, almost unbearable intensity. What began as a series of erratic gestures and sudden shouts quickly escalated into something far more serious. A confrontation that no one present would ever forget. Every person in the room felt it. A shift from anxiety to fear, from anticipation to the raw edge of unpredictability. The courtroom was no longer a place of measured legal proceedings. It had transformed into a stage for a psychological drama where every second could ignite chaos. Nick Reiner, still bound by shackles and clad in the bright orange suicide prevention smock, was at the center of the storm. His movements were no longer intermittent. They were continuous, almost frantic. His voice alternated between muttered words and sharp, high-pitched exclamations. Observers describe a sense of volatility that seemed almost tangible, as if the very air in the room had become charged, vibrating with tension. And every action was amplified by the presence of cameras, reporters, and the legal teams struggling to maintain order. Consider for a moment the perspective of the court staff and security. They were trained to anticipate disruption, to intervene with measured authority, and to protect everyone present. But even the most experienced officers are not always prepared for behavior that oscillates unpredictably between clarity and explosive action. 1 second, Nick might respond coherently to a question from his attorney. The next, he would lunge, shout, or flail, testing the limits of restraint. Every step, every motion required immediate judgment. Any miscalculation could lead to injury, further escalation, or catastrophic consequences. The escalation seemed almost rhythmic, a pulse of chaos that built with each passing moment. The judge called repeatedly for order, his voice echoing sharply in the courtroom. "Please be seated. Restrain yourselves." But the commands had limited effect. Nick's agitation had reached a level that words alone could not temper. Security personnel moved closer, forming a protective barrier around him, their expressions tense and focused. Every microsecond mattered. One misstep could transform a contained outburst into something far more dangerous. Observers outside the courtroom, watching through live feeds and social media coverage, were riveted. There were debates, speculation, and an almost collective attempt to interpret what they were seeing. Some suggested a psychological breakdown, others saw calculated defiance. But the truth, as always, was more complex. Human behavior under extreme stress defies easy categorization. Fear, shame, frustration, and a sense of impending doom can collide to produce reactions that appear irrational, even to the individual experiencing them. Amid the chaos, the lawyers played a delicate game. Alan Jackson, the defense attorney, attempted to calm Nick, using both verbal cues and subtle physical guidance. Every word was chosen carefully, every gesture measured. The goal was not only to protect his client, but also to preserve the integrity of the proceedings. On the prosecution side, the team watched closely, documenting every motion, every utterance, and every sign of volatility. They understood that each moment could be crucial evidence, but they also had to contend with the immediate danger of an unpredictable and highly emotional individual. What makes these moments so gripping is the juxtaposition between the structured environment of the courtroom and the chaotic unpredictability of human behavior. Law is designed to impose order, but it cannot eliminate the human element. Every gesture, every shout, every erratic movement becomes magnified, observed, and interpreted in real time. And for Nick, the pressure of public attention, combined with the weight of legal consequences and personal emotional turmoil, created a perfect storm that would soon reach a breaking point. It was during one particularly volatile sequence that the situation crossed a line that no one could ignore. Nick suddenly stood fully upright, voice rising into a pitch that cut through the courtroom like a knife. He gestured toward multiple individuals, his movements rapid and disjointed. The defense attorney attempted to speak, but his words were drowned out by the intensity of the outburst. Security personnel moved quickly, but Nick's momentum was difficult to counter. Cameras captured the chaos, flashbulbs illuminating the scene with stark, almost surreal clarity. Observers outside the room felt the tension viscerally, as if they too were caught in the unfolding storm. What would you do if you were present in that moment? Could you remain composed while witnessing someone at the edge of emotional collapse? Could you distinguish between danger and expression, between a plea for help and a threat? The answers are not simple. Human intuition often fails under extreme conditions, and even trained professionals must make split-second decisions with incomplete information. Every choice carried consequences, both legal and psychological. As the confrontation escalated, the courtroom became a battleground of control and resistance. Nick's behavior continued to alternate between moments of partial compliance and sudden aggression. The clinking of shackles, the rustling of the suicide prevention smock, the rapid exchange of commands and responses, all combined into a chaotic symphony that heightened the tension for everyone present. Lawyers, security officers, and spectators alike were forced to navigate a scenario that blurred the lines between legal procedure, psychological crisis, and raw human drama. And then, in a moment that would later define the narrative of the trial, Nick made a movement so unexpected, so forceful, that it triggered an immediate intervention. Security personnel acted instantly, converging on him with a combination of restraint techniques designed to prevent harm while maintaining legal and procedural boundaries. The room erupted with a mix of gasps, shouts, and the metallic clash of restraints. Reporters frantically adjusted their cameras, capturing the unprecedented level of intensity unfolding before them. Yet even in this chaos, there were glimpses of humanity. Alan Jackson remained at his client's side, speaking in measured tones, attempting to navigate the emotional and psychological turbulence while preserving legal strategy. The judge maintained composure, directing proceedings with a mix of authority and caution. Observers within the courtroom were left oscillating between fear, fascination, and disbelief. The unfolding events were not just news. They were a masterclass in human unpredictability, a study of behavior under extreme stress, and a reminder that even structured environments cannot contain the full range of human emotion. For the public following from afar, the story took on almost mythic proportions. Video clips circulated widely, social media feeds exploded with commentary, and every detail was analyzed, debated, and dissected. What drove Nick to this point? Was this a singular eruption, or a symptom of deeper psychological and familial issues? Could anyone have predicted such volatility? The questions multiplied with every second, creating a cycle of anticipation and suspense that kept the audience engaged, horrified, and captivated simultaneously. And just when it seemed that the situation might be brought under control, another twist occurred. A single, seemingly minor action, a gesture, a shouted word, a movement toward the gallery, rekindled the volatility, reigniting the chaos with renewed intensity. The courtroom, already tense, became a pressure cooker once more. Security personnel acted immediately, journalists struggled to capture the moment, and spectators collectively held their breath. The unpredictability of the moment left everyone acutely aware that nothing about this day would follow conventional expectations. The first full-scale confrontation was not merely a display of emotional intensity. It was a window into the underlying dynamics of a family and a young man grappling with unimaginable pressure, fear, and isolation. It was a collision of psychology, law, and human behavior, and it set the stage for further eruptions that would continue to define both the trial and public perception. Every gesture, every outburst, every reaction had consequences that extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom, reverberating through media coverage, public discourse, and the legal process itself. And as the day drew on, one realization became undeniable. The courtroom, for all its structure and authority, was not a container for human emotion. It was a stage for a drama that had been years in the making, a drama in which every participant, lawyers, judges, security, media, and the accused, was caught in a tense, unpredictable, and high-stakes dance. But just when it seemed the situation had reached its peak, the next sequence of events would push the courtroom into a level of chaos even greater than before, revealing more about Nick's state of mind and the pressures that had led to this unprecedented breakdown. The courtroom, once a place of relative order, now bore the marks of chaos. Papers were scattered across desks, chairs had been shifted out of place, and the air was thick with tension, a mix of lingering fear, adrenaline, and disbelief. Lawyers, security personnel, and the judge alike were forced to pause and reassess. How could they contain an individual whose volatility seemed limitless? Every detail, every nuance of the previous confrontation replayed in their minds, and every second of delay carried the risk of another eruption. Outside the courtroom, the world was waiting. Reporters had already begun transmitting live updates, their voices carrying over airwaves and digital feeds across the globe. Social media exploded with snippets of video, eyewitness accounts, and speculation. Unbelievable behavior, one headline read. Courtroom chaos as accused son erupts, another warned. And while viewers were riveted, the deeper questions remained. Why had this happened? How could a young man in shackles, under professional legal guidance, erupt with such intensity? And what did this reveal about the pressures, history, and psychology behind the events? Back inside, the courtroom attempted to regain composure. Security officers moved with precise coordination, ensuring that Nick was seated, restrained, and monitored closely. The judge, visibly tense but resolute, addressed the room with measured authority, calling for decorum and order. Lawyers whispered urgently, recalibrating their approach. Defense attorney Alan Jackson maintained a calm, steady presence, speaking softly to Nick, reminding him to breathe, to comply, to focus. It was a delicate balance, maintaining legal strategy while simultaneously managing a human being on the edge. Meanwhile, the prosecution faced its own challenges. Each action, each movement by Nick, was being recorded, analyzed, and potentially used as evidence. But the unpredictable nature of the outburst created an environment where any misstep could be exploited. They had to observe without provoking, document without interference, and plan for contingencies in a space that had just proven wildly volatile. Every eye in the room was alert, every second scrutinized, as if the next misstep could set off another storm. The media frenzy outside mirrored the intensity inside. News networks scrambled to provide live coverage, commentators speculated on motives, and social media erupted with opinions ranging from shock to sympathy to outright judgment. Clips of the courtroom eruption circulated rapidly, accumulating views by the millions. The narrative was already taking shape: a son, accused of an unimaginable crime, spiraling under pressure in front of the entire world. And while the public consumed each clip with morbid fascination, the courtroom itself had only just begun to process the unfolding reality. What makes such moments gripping to the public is not just the sensationalism, it's the human drama at the core. Viewers, readers, and followers are drawn to questions that cannot be answered quickly or easily. What drives someone to lose control in such extreme circumstances? How do family history, personal struggles, and psychological factors converge to create moments of explosive behavior? And, perhaps most chillingly, how close are we to understanding or empathizing with the individual at the center of it all? In the immediate aftermath, attempts were made to de-escalate the situation. Security and court staff worked tirelessly to re-establish a sense of order. Nick was monitored for signs of continued agitation, his behavior observed not just for the safety of those present, but also for his own well-being. The bright orange suicide prevention smock remained a visual reminder that mental health considerations were paramount, a protective measure in a scenario where the human mind and emotion were dangerously unpredictable. The judge, aware of the stakes, emphasized the importance of decorum and compliance. His words, though firm, carried an undertone of caution. This was not a scenario that could be approached casually. Each command, each instruction, had to account for both legal and psychological consequences. And yet, even as order was tentatively restored, an underlying tension lingered, a sense that the courtroom was holding its collective breath, waiting for the next spark. Observers within the room noted subtle changes in Nick's demeanor. There were moments of stillness, brief pauses where it seemed as though he was gathering himself. But these were punctuated by sudden flares, gestures, muttered phrases, rapid eye movements that reminded everyone that volatility was still present. The oscillation between control and chaos created an almost unbearable suspense, forcing everyone to remain hyper-alert. Lawyers, security officers, and court personnel alike understood that any second could shift the balance. Outside, the media continued to dissect every detail. Analysts debated the significance of the outburst, speculated about Nick's mental state, and examined the potential impact on the legal proceedings. Social media amplified the story further, with clips being shared, commented on, and analyzed in real time. Public curiosity and horror were entwined, creating a feedback loop that ensured the story would dominate headlines for days, weeks, and potentially months. Every detail mattered. Every second of footage became part of a broader narrative, and every observer felt the irresistible pull of the unfolding drama. Amid the frenzy, one cannot overlook the human cost. This was not merely a story of courtroom spectacle. It was the manifestation of years of tension, pressure, and unresolved emotional struggles. Nick's behavior was the visible tip of a hidden iceberg. A combination of family dynamics, personal challenges, and psychological strain that had reached a critical breaking point. Understanding the full scope required examining not only what happened in that courtroom, but also the life experiences, familial relationships, and psychological patterns that had led to this moment. The courtroom itself now functioned as both legal forum and psychological pressure chamber. Every movement by Nick, every reaction from attorneys or officers, every visual cue became part of a delicate negotiation of safety, legal integrity, and human behavior. Each person present had to make split-second decisions, balancing protocol against instinct, authority against empathy, and caution against action. The unpredictability of human emotion in high-stakes scenarios was on full display, leaving no room for error, no margin for miscalculation. And just when it seemed that the courtroom might finally regain stability, another minor incident, an unexpected gesture, a sudden sound, or a misinterpreted movement, threatened to undo all progress. The room's fragile equilibrium was a reminder that volatility, once unleashed, can never be fully contained. Observers knew that the next eruption could be even more dramatic, more public, and more consequential. The media frenzy outside mirrored the danger inside. Headlines screamed for attention, videos went viral, and social feeds buzzed with speculation. But amid all this coverage, the human story remained central. A young man facing unimaginable pressure, a family torn by tragedy, and a courtroom caught between law and raw human emotion. Each element fed the narrative, heightening suspense, deepening intrigue, and leaving the audience questioning what could possibly happen next. And as everyone in the courtroom braced for what would follow, it became painfully clear this was only the beginning. The chaos of the first confrontation had set the stage for a series of events that would continue to escalate, each more unpredictable and revealing than the last. The stakes were higher than ever, and the unfolding drama had only just begun. But the most shocking moments were yet to come, moments that would challenge assumptions, redefine public perception, and push the limits of legal procedure, human behavior, and emotional endurance. The courtroom had become a stage for chaos, but beyond the legal and media frenzy, there were faces etched with shock, fear, and disbelief. The family, the legal teams, and the audience trapped in the immediate gravity of the moment. For many, it was one thing to watch a story unfold on television or read it in the morning headlines. It was quite another to witness a young man, accused of the unthinkable, unravel right in front of you. To feel the tension, hear the shouts, see the frantic gestures, it was almost unbearable. The reactions of family members present were perhaps the most heart-wrenching. Those closest to Nick, relatives who had supported, loved, or worried about him over the years, were caught between fear and grief. Some could not tear their eyes away, frozen by a mix of disbelief and sorrow. Others pressed hands over mouths, unable to process what they were seeing. Every movement by Nick, every erratic gesture, every shout seemed to carry a dual weight. The immediate danger and the painful recognition of a son, a brother, a loved one spiraling beyond comprehension. It raises a question that haunts every tragic family story. How do you reconcile love with fear? How do you process the image of someone you care for, someone you've known intimately, acting in ways that are both incomprehensible and dangerous? The courtroom became a crucible for these emotions, forcing everyone present to confront the raw, unfiltered intersection of human vulnerability, familial bonds, and extreme circumstance. Legal teams, too, had to navigate treacherous waters. Defense attorneys worked to stabilize Nick, speaking in calm, deliberate tones, their words designed to guide, reassure, and redirect him. Alan Jackson, in particular, became a steadying presence, leaning close, whispering instructions, and attempting to create a psychological anchor in the midst of a storm. Yet every word carried the risk of misinterpretation. Every movement by Nick could reverse the fragile balance they had painstakingly established.